Today's guest is Hank Lutton. Hank Lutton is a historian, scholar, and registered professional archaeologist who specializes in historical archaeology. Hank is currently a curator at the Great Creek Mound Archaeological Complex in Moundsville. Please welcome Hank Lutton.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm used to bouncing around the stage and pointing, so if I pull away from the mic, just holler at me and let me know. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and spending your noon hour here. It's seldom that my professional training intersects with my personal passion in the First World War, so it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank the library for the opportunity to be here with you. Now, before I begin, I need to make two caveats. The first is that while I'm speaking, I may inadvertently slip and refer to the conflict as the Great War. Most Americans refer to it as the First World War, World War I, but all the terms can be used interchangeably. So if I slip and say Great War, it's all the same conflict. Secondly, this presentation includes some images of human remains, and I don't include them to be sensational or disrespectful. They're in there because the First World War was one of the most dehumanizing events in human history. Those who participated in it were degraded, and often their bodies were not treated properly. So it's through archaeology and forensics that we try to identify these individuals, understand how they died, and make contact with the families to try to reunite them. So I see it as something that restores humanity to these people who have often been stripped of it. But if that bothers you and you need to get up and step out, please feel free to. There's nothing gory, but I don't want it to bother anyone's lunch or your sensibilities. All right. As you know from the People's University, this is the 100th anniversary of the United States entering the First World War. On the 6th of April, 1917, the U.S. Congress voted, at the request of President Woodrow Wilson, to declare war on the Empire of Germany. This was almost 3 years after most of the world and most of Europe had been embroiled in the deadliest conflict up until that point. The First World War was cataclysmic to those people who didn't know what was coming in August 1914. It consumed nearly 11 million combatants, more than 7 million civilians, and those numbers don't even include those who succumbed in the influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1919. The First World War was a threshold. It gave birth to the modern era. All the things that we think of as commonplace in the 20th century and the 21st century had their genesis between 1914 and 1919. The forces unleashed by this conflict destroyed empires, uprooted peoples. It was the first large-scale example of genocide in the modern period. Communism rose as a result. And in the instability of an unjust peace treaty, strong men and thugs like Hitler and Mussolini were able to come to power. Everything that has followed since can be directly tied back to the effects of the war or the Treaty of Versailles, such as the Second World War, the Cold War, our continued animosity with Russia. What the political instability in Africa, and ethnic and religious instability in the Middle East all have their roots in the war. And things that we take as commonplace today in medicine, plastic surgery, blood transfusions, the treating of emotional trauma, all have their origins here. Oops, pardon me. Militarily, the technology that was unleashed and perfected in the First World War are still the things that we continue to use in our military arsenals today. Submarines, tanks, aircraft, and unfortunately, chemical warfare. Now, if you will, take note of the gas masks that will come into play in one of the, later on in the presentation. So if the First World War was so momentous, why is it that professional archaeologists have been slow to explore the war in the battlefields? The very first professional excavation on a World War I battlefield did not occur until 1991. The first book published on the archaeology of the war wasn't published until 2007. Why is this? One of the reasons is that archaeologists, especially academics, considered the topic to be too recent. They thought that because this war was so exhaustively documented that they couldn't contribute anything new. After all, there are millions of photographs, thousands of reels of film. There are oral histories, letters, memoirs. And until 2009, when Harry Patch died, you could ask combat veterans who had been in the trenches what it was like. Perhaps the most formidable obstacle to archaeologists and deterrent was what is referred to as the iron harvest. Every year in Belgium and France, farmers are killed and maimed as they till their fields and strike unexploded artillery shells. And every several years, technicians who dispose of them and disarm them are killed and maimed as a result. Now, the image behind me shows a pile of ordnance, much of it artillery shells, that was collected in 1 year on one Belgian farm. So you can understand why archaeologists were a little bit reluctant to go sticking their trowels and shovels in the ground of France. But this all changed, largely because of this man's reputation. Alain Fournier was a much beloved French author. Although he only published one novel before he was killed in 1914, that novel still today continues to capture the imagination of the French public. He has devotees that adore him. His novel has never been out of print. Fournier, in 1914, when war erupted, was commissioned as a lieutenant. And several months into the conflict, he and 20 Frenchmen were sent on a patrol into a forest near Verdun. They walked into the forest, and the French army never saw them again. The army could find no evidence of what happened to them. There was no trace. And so as a result of his sudden disappearance and the excitement that he sparked in French literary society, conspiracy theories began to emerge what had happened to him. Rumors that the Germans had captured and executed him and his men spread like wildfire. Some of his most enthusiastic supporters began conducting research, and they spent 14 years going through military records, trying to find evidence. And in 1990, they found in German military records an eyewitness account by a German soldier who described the ambush of Fournier and his men, and how they were all cut down in gunfire. And their bodies were taken and placed in a mass grave. And the account was so specific that these researchers were able to narrow down the location of the grave to 1 acre. At that point, they were able to persuade professional archaeologists to come in and proceed with finding the grave and uncovering it. This is what they found. A burial pit with 21 individuals in it. They had been buried in their uniforms, although most of the textile had since deteriorated. But as you can see, the leather boots were exceptionally well preserved. And there was evidence that the Germans had dumped them in with their kits because there are piles of ammunition in pockets scattered around. Fortunately, and this is a very, very rare incident, almost all these soldiers were wearing early ID discs. So the researchers were able to identify almost all of them based on that. Those that didn't have discs, they were able to match up with their enlistment records, which described their height and weight and build. So eventually they were able to remove them to a nearby military cemetery and give them all individual graves. One of the things that came out of this was, first of all, the realization that when the Germans buried them, they seemed to be cognizant of the rank of the Frenchmen. What we have is Alain Fournier, number 16, is lying next to the captain. Here's the sub-lieutenant who's next to the NCO. All the rest of the men in the trench are enlisted. So there seemed to have been some acknowledgement by the Germans as they were handling their bodies of aligning them more or less by their military status. The other important thing that came out of this was that for the first time, the personal effects and the artifacts recovered did not go to a museum. They weren't sold. Instead, they were given to descendants of the soldiers when they could be identified. And when they couldn't, those remains were entrusted to the French army. This was a very sharp departure. Before professional archaeologists began working on battlefields from the war, amateurs often did it. And they would go out on the weekend and they would collect the artifacts, sometimes sell them, put them on display, create a little museum, and charge admission. This was the first time where the descendants and the victims sort of were able to take back control of these symbolic artifacts. And this, of course, is Fournier's grave. Now, archaeology can also address some of the most dramatic events of the First World War. In May of 1915, an English passenger liner, the Lusitania, was in New York Harbor. As was custom, they handed over a manifest to port authorities. As the ship was steaming out of the harbor, a second manifest was handed over. This one claimed that there was small arms ammunition on board the Lusitania. Now, the symbolism of this is that under international law, the Germans could not torpedo a passenger liner unless it was carrying war material. As the Lusitania approached the coast of Ireland, it was spotted by a German U-boat that fired one torpedo. It struck the hull of the ship, and shortly thereafter there was a second, much larger explosion. And the Lusitania went down in a matter of minutes, claiming 1,200 lives. Now, since that happened, there has been a raging debate. The Germans claimed there was war material on board that created the secondary explosion. Others, some have proposed that it was cold water rushing into the boiler that could have caused the explosion. It's been, again, conspiracy theories back and forth. No one really knew what had happened, and all there was a document without any physical evidence. Well, the evidence was found in 2008 when the owner of the Lusitania mounted a privately owned expedition. They were able to get a submersible partially into the cargo hold, and when they did, they found approximately 4 million rounds. Wrong device. 4 million rounds of .303 caliber, which was the standard British ammunition for machine guns and for rifles. And to prove that they actually found it, the submersible was able to grab these shells and bring them back to the surface. So, under international law, the Lusitania, as immoral as it sounds, was a legitimate military target for the Germans. The question that's still unresolved is what caused the secondary explosion. Were there larger munitions, like artillery shells and things that were potentially unstable and could cause that explosion on board? The owner has petitioned the Irish government to go down and remove plates from the side of the ship so they can see more clearly into the cargo hold, and also to examine the boiler to see if there's evidence of an explosion. However, they are at loggerheads now. The Irish consider this to be a grave site, and they don't want the owner doing anything that could undermine the integrity of the hull of the ship and cause it to collapse any more quickly than it is. So at present, it's unresolved. Stay tuned, because in the future, something may happen and we may finally know what caused that secondary explosion. All right, how many people have seen this 1981 film, Gallipoli, starring a very young Mel Gibson? All right, a couple. The reason I ask is because I'll give a little bit of background then. The movie is about a failed campaign that was launched in 1915 that was an attempt to take the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The Gallipoli campaign took place here on this peninsula. It is at the interface of Europe and Asia. The Dardanelles passed through a very narrow channel of water that's been very strategic for millennia. The war wasn't going well for the Allies in 1915, so First Lord of Admiralty Winston Churchill decided they would take a combined English-French fleet and just steam up through there. They would fire on the Ottoman Empire capital at Istanbul, force them to surrender, and then supply ships would be able to travel up into the Black Sea and take supplies and material to Russia. It unfolded quite differently. As the fleet tried to sail through, the Turkish gunners and forts and navy, which had laid minefields, sank quite a number of the ships and damaged others. So then, they made amphibious landings on the west coast of the Gallipoli campaign, on the peninsula right here, with the intention of marching across and capturing the forts. However, the Ottoman army proved to be more tenacious than they expected, and the campaign soon bogged down into a stalemate. Archaeologists have worked on this battlefield because it is the best preserved one of the war. When they started in 2009, there was no management plan. The Turkish government didn't even really know what was on the battlefield. Memorials had been created, there were vestiges of the earthworks, but everything was undocumented. So an international team of Turks, Australians, and New Zealanders teamed up and went in and and did a survey to identify features and to try to come up with a plan to better preserve the battlefield. The terrain there is inhospitable. You have very shallow coves, such as this one where the Australians and New Zealanders landed, with precipitous cliffs rising up behind it. There are lots of ravines and sharp drop-offs, eroded soil, so it made it difficult for archaeologists to come in and put a traditional grid in and walk along predetermined lines. So they came up with an unconventional strategy that they would follow first the trenches and then document everything off of that on the assumption that they wouldn't build a trench on land that you could not stand on. And they also did something that was a departure from tradition. Normally, archaeologists do their research up front before they go into the field to help them understand what they find and give it context. In this case, they decided they didn't want to bias themselves. There was so many photographs and maps. They felt that if they did this research beforehand, they would see features in the landscape and automatically call them how they had been identified in the maps and in the photographs. So they literally used their archaeological eyes, recorded things, and then later they fused all the information together. This is typical of what they found. Eroded trenches that are still visible, but you can see they've probably lost about 4 feet of soil. And dugouts that are framed in timber with a door going into the underground passage. This was actually one of the more spectacular finds. The lower image has a well with a watering trough. However, this area is enlarged up here. In 1915, British soldiers were digging a trench at Gallipoli when they came across a Greek cemetery. That is a Greek sarcophagus. When the British uncovered this sarcophagus in 1915, an officer described it. He wrote down the inscription, he translated it, and he published it in an archaeology journal. When the archaeologist found this on the battlefield, it had the same inscription and the same characteristics. So after the Allies evacuated off of Gallipoli, some Ottoman farmer found this sarcophagus and mortared it into the end of his watering trough for his animals to drink from. And it's still on the battlefield today. Archaeologists often use the term Pompeii Effect to describe when a moment is frozen in time. It, of course, comes from the volcanic eruption that buried, from Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. It's rare that archaeologists always find something like that. Things are often altered later. People come back and salvage things. So it's very rare to find a site that can be said to have the Pompeii Effect. However, in 2012, while constructing a highway, French archaeologists did. What they found was a German dugout that had been destroyed in March 1918. It was very well reinforced. It was nearly 18 feet below the surface of the earth. It was reinforced with heavy timbers. And the French army decided that they needed to eliminate this. And they fired several specially designed artillery shells that had a delayed fuse so that the shells penetrated into or near the bunker before they exploded. When that happened, the entire complex caved in a matter of seconds, killing the German soldiers instantaneously, or nearly instantaneously. You can see the soil around the site is saturated with water, and it's a very heavy clay that together create an anaerobic environment that shuts out oxygen and slows down the deterioration of organic material. So you can actually see the steps descending into it and the floorboards that the German soldiers would have walked on. This is one of the galleries running down the length of it. The collapse happened so quickly that archaeologists actually found German soldiers still sitting, at least their skeletons, still sitting upright, where the soil entombed them that quickly. This is one of the soldiers they found curled in a fetal position. They think he was either walking up the steps or down when the explosion occurred, and he seems to have been thrown back to the bottom of the steps, curled in that position. And quite poignantly, it appears that one of his fellow soldiers was buried next to him and was reaching out with his left hand, perhaps to assist him, when this timber collapsed and crushed his cranium. This is a boot from one of the German soldiers. You can see the upper leather has deteriorated, but the sole is still intact, and you can see it's a leather leg protector that's still on the lower leg. Here's one of the beds that was in the dugout. The wire mesh was on which a mattress or blankets could be placed. There's a helmet and bottle. The preservation was still good, but there were pieces and fragments of German newspaper that were still legible, as well as leather things, holsters, ammunition pouches, a boot jack that were preserved in this almost perfect conditions for preservation. The archaeologists were astounded by the permanency of the construction of this Chilean shelter, this dugout. There were heavy frame timbers, expertly built. They had electric, there were heat sources, water pumps to keep the water from infiltrating into the shelter, and even telephones. They were just about as comfortable as one could be in a dugout in the First World War. And they even found a skeleton of a goat right here in the foreground that they were probably relying on as a source of milk. As comfortable as they may have been, the archaeologists found evidence of intestinal parasites in all of the remains that they found. And there was an interesting correlation. Enlisted soldiers tended to have higher parasite counts than non-commissioned officers and the single officer that they found. And these parasites were probably contaminating their food. They're theorizing it was probably rat feces. So as comfortable as they may have been, they were still in an unpleasant situation. Archaeology often gives us information about burial practices and customs. This is a mass grave of 20 English Tommies. They were one of the famed, or I should say infamous PAL battalions. These were from the Grimsby Chums. These were found when a BMW factory was being constructed. Does anyone notice anything unusual about the remains? There's 20 men. They're all wearing their boots. That tells us that English soldiers probably buried them because the Germans, who were desperate for leather, had inferior quality boots and would often take them from Allied soldiers. So we think they're buried by English soldiers, and almost all of them were missing their unit badges. And a letter from one of the members of the Grimsby Chums said that his friend had died the day before in this letter, and that he had taken his badge off his uniform to send back to his family. So all indication, without having a document, is that these were buried by their fellow soldiers. But there's something unusual in the skeletons. Anyone? All right. You see 18 skeletons that are mostly complete. What happens here? You have 4 boots with 2 legs, a right arm, and part of a cranium. The bodies are incomplete and missing most of their skeletal structure. These 2 men were probably together when they were directly struck by an artillery shell that disintegrated or blew away most of their bones. But what do you notice about the placement of those body parts? They're anatomically correct. So their mates, as they were laying them in there, took the effort to place their arm where it would be if their body was whole, and their foot and their leg, which is a lot of handling of body parts that's unnecessary, but suggests that there was tenderness and perhaps devotion to their friends. And this is the stuff that archaeology can sort of contribute, because nobody writes this down in letters home. You don't tell mom that you're handling body parts. The official regimental history doesn't talk about this. They talk about the battles and the generals. And this is one of the great contributions of archaeology, is getting down to the individual and the experience of the individual. Burial 124 is sort of the poster child of archaeology on the Western Front. Archaeologists encountered a body of an English soldier, and according to maps, would have been no man's land. He was wearing a badge which indicated that he was a member of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, one of the more elite units. Documents indicated that the Royal Welsh Fusiliers were in these trenches between January and July 1917. Coincidentally, coins on him were minted in 1917, so everything matches up nicely. His personal effects consisted of a toothbrush, a pocket knife, a trench mirror, and pencils. Trench mirror is a periscope-type device, so that it has reflective mirrors, so it can be put up above the trench so that you don't have to stick your head up and become a target. And there was no evidence of trauma on his body. What archaeologists pieced together, but before I go there, I'll point out a few things. His boots are still preserved. He has his entrenching tool right here at his waist. These are unused ammunition shells that were probably in a leather or a canvas bandolier that he wore over his chest. That disc right there, remember the gas mask I pointed out earlier? That's a lens for a gas mask. That being that close to his face indicates he was more than likely wearing the mask when he died. Because there was no trauma on his body, the archaeologists that recovered his remains have theorized that he was in what's known as a sap, a trench that runs out from the front trench into no man's land. These were used as observation posts. And he was probably out there with the trench mirror, looking around, taking notes, when an artillery barrage occurred, perhaps with poison gas, which would be why he put the mask on. And he was most likely probably killed by the detonation of a shell close to him, so that he would have been killed by the concussive wave of the blast. This was common in the First World War and conflict since, that soldiers could literally be killed without any physical evidence to their skin or to their skeleton if their organs are destroyed by the blast wave. Sorry if you do this during lunch. All right, the last case study that I want to mention, and we'll wrap things up, is associated with the Battle of Frommel, which occurred in 1916. Frommel is notorious because of the high casualty rate in a very short amount of time. After the start of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British realized things weren't going well, and they wanted to try to create a diversionary attack so their main attack could gain more momentum. They took a division of British soldiers and a division of Australians. With very poor planning, very hastily designed strategy, decided they would throw them against a strong point in the German line. The Germans had higher elevation. They were dug in. This was one of the more formidable defensive works on the Western Front. And they were manned by a veteran Bavarian unit. And unfortunately, the Australians that were used had just arrived in the Western Front. They didn't know the landscape, and they hadn't even been issued helmets yet. The Germans knew they were coming, and they launched the attack on a clear afternoon. And the German machine guns and artillery slaughtered these soldiers. It was over in minutes, although stragglers continued to come back over the course of a night. The Australians lost 5,500 killed and wounded. Very few were actually captured. And it's the bloodiest day in Australian military history. So in Australia, the word Frommel resonates and creates a lot of disdain and sorrow. One of the participants in this battle was a very young Bavarian, actually born in Austria, corporal named Adolf Hitler. And you can see the bottom image is actually a propaganda postcard of Australian and British bodies that the Germans published and circulated. Both sides would do this, but the Germans did it quite frequently. So the Australian government, under increasing pressure, contacted Tony Pollard, who's a noted battlefield archaeologist. Because at Frommel, a large number of the Australian soldiers were never recovered. They fell in no man's land and in German trenches. So they were buried by the Germans. And while there were German records saying they had been buried in mass graves, there was no map with an X. Pollard was asked to investigate based upon information that researchers had uncovered. He used a lot of sources of information, but this one aerial photograph was key. This is a photograph taken after the battle, and it depicts near the wood line at least 3 open pits. Right here, those dark images are the shadow being thrown into an open pit. And just to the west of it, you can see there's a lighter color where soil has been turned over and filled back in. Pollard and the research indicated that these could be the 8 mass graves that were dug by the Germans for the killed Australian and British soldiers. They used a variety of technologies, ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography. The ground-penetrating radar wasn't particularly successful because of the very dense clay in this part of France. But they did a metal detecting survey, and it picked up the usual bullets, shell casings, shrapnel, but it found something that was the needle in the haystack. It found this medallion, and there's a replica right next to it. That medallion was given by the Shire of Alberton in Australia to soldiers from their shire that enlisted. There was only one soldier missing in action at the Battle of Frommel who was known to have been awarded that. And that is Private Harry Willis. So based on that evidence, Pollard predicted that Harry Willis's remains were in one of those pits, because he hypothesized that as the Germans were moving the bodies to the pit, this medallion slipped out of his clothing, and it was found very close to where the aerial photographs showed the pits to be. When the Australian government got this information, they invested seriously to support this project. They created semi-permanent structures that the archaeologists could put over the pits so that the weather would not affect them or the remains as they excavated them. They created a complex of mobile housing to act as an office, a laboratory, and a temporary morgue. They installed security, there's fences around there to keep people away, and to keep prying eyes from looking in as they exhumed the remains. And Pollard said that even before they found the first bone, they could smell the decay of organic material, and they knew they had a mass grave. They uncovered 8 pits. There were 50 souls. Not all of them were filled. The Germans had dug more than they needed. But they exhumed a total of 250 sets of remains. And this site was unusual because over 5,000 artifacts were found, which is a very high number. These range from, of course, military buttons and grommets from canvas sheets to personal items, such as the smoking pipe, the change purse with the coin, and the fountain pen that some soldier would have written letters home to his family with. One of the most common artifacts were rosaries and crucifixes. This has been noted on other excavations of fallen on the battlefield. You had very many Protestant soldiers that once they got to France and realized what it was like on the battlefield, started going and buying what were considered traditional Catholic charms and tokens and using these as a sign of faith. This is something they didn't write home and tell their family about, but there's evidence of it. So this is what archaeology does, is try to glean that information that's not in the documents and work with it to better understand how people lived and experienced the war. This is probably the most poignant artifact uncovered from Frommel. It's a railway ticket. It was found stuffed, folded and stuffed inside a gas mask. The soldier probably did this because the gas mask itself would offer protection from moisture. Plus, the mask would have been stuffed in a bag that he wore on his chest. So it would be insulated from the weather. It would help preserve it. This was a rail ticket from Fremantle, Australia to Perth. This man probably took the train to Perth to enlist. And this was the return trip that he expected to take to cash this ticket in and ride from Perth to Fremantle when the war was over. But he never had the opportunity. To date, over half of the remains that were recovered at Frommel have been identified through DNA. The Australian government supported a very large testing system so that Australians could swab themselves, send it in, and see if there were matches for the soldiers that were recovered in this mass grave. So over half have been, over half of the soldiers have been, their descendants have been informed, artifacts have been returned to them, and this, of course, is the niece of Harry Willis. And when you watch the videos of these people being informed that their ancestors have been found, it's very emotional. And they always make it clear what a loss and what a void it was, if not for them, for their parents and their grandparents who had lost this, an uncle, a brother, a fiance, a husband. When you see that, Pollard and his staff were overwhelmed with the emotional connection they made with the descendants, and continue to do as more and more are identified. So where is archaeology going in the First World War now? As you can see, in 1991, there was no reliance on DNA. The technology didn't exist. As it's become more inexpensive and commonplace, a greater reliance is being used to try to connect descendants with their fallen ancestors. Most of these studies that I mentioned were done on the Western Front in Belgium and France, but increasingly archaeologists are looking at other theaters of war. And so, for instance, the Alps is someplace that's starting to get a lot of attention, where the Austrian-Hungarian Empire fought the Italian nation. As there is global warming and the glaciers are retreating, literally it's exposing trenches, bodies, dugouts, artillery pieces. So there's a race to sort of document this before the change in environmental conditions begins to destroy the artifacts. There's an increasing awareness amongst archaeologists that they have to do more than just talk about fighting and dying. They need to focus on aspects like the home front, on hospital care, POW camps, and training centers. Just recently on the Salisbury Plain in England, archaeologists uncovered practice tunnels that their soldiers were practicing tunneling so that when they got to France, they could tunnel under the German lines, plant explosives, and blow them up. Now, until this was found, there was no evidence they had ever practiced this. Everyone thought they took miners from Scotland and the north of England and Australia and sent them off to do their thing. But we now know, just as there were practice trenches, there were practice tunnels, which might explain why the British were more successful in their tunneling activities. And archaeologists need to focus on the daily life. They need to find features and deposits that they can excavate that talk more about the living and the coping and not just necessarily the dying. And they're focusing more on material culture, not only the artifacts that are found on the battlefield, but the things that were inspired by the battlefield. There's a phenomenon known as trench art. I don't know if any of the speakers talked about that in the People's University, but there was an entire cottage industry of taking shell casings and making jewelry from them, making vases, umbrella stands. This example behind me are made from a French 75 artillery shells, and they bear the name of two French villages that were obliterated and never rebuilt. Sometimes they were personalized with soldiers' names on them, and they would sit in the center piece of the dining room or on a sideboard or in the living room as a constant reminder of the war and perhaps what was lost. So archaeologists need to think about that and think about things in a broader term of conflict, not just the isolated battlefield, but more holistically about all the elements. All right, sorry to be such a downer. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
One was about the intestinal parasites. How in the world, at this point, could they identify an intestinal parasite?
Did everyone hear that? Yeah. She was asking how archaeologists were able to identify the presence of intestinal parasites in the German soldiers that were in the bunker that collapsed. They didn't actually find the parasites because those would have deteriorated with the intestines. But what they found were eggs that had been preserved. That's just like often, archaeologists, all they need is the seed to know what the vegetation was like or what was being planted. And did you have a second one?
Yes. Are you familiar with the trench art and in the cave art from World War I? Do you say anything about that?
Yeah. The questions about trench art in the form of caves, and in France. Near a place called Vimy Ridge, which was the site of a very famous Canadian victory against what was considered to be an impregnable German position. The Canadians won this great victory. To stage the troops before the attack, the British Army placed the troops underground in these limestone caverns that had been carved out for building material and for lime. And that there were these perfect sort of pre-made shelters. And so while the soldiers were waiting, they would often carve their name, carve images into it. There's one cave that American soldiers, I think it was published, photos of it were published in, I believe, American Heritage and the Smithsonian, that show eagles, stars and stripes, their name, their girlfriend's name, the towns they're from, whatever was on their mind and important to them. But a lot of this is just, for the first time, being documented. And now we have to think about how to interpret it and how to process it and put it together with all the other pieces we have. Yes?
I wanted to ask, the pictures of the mass graves where you can actually see the remains, the skeletons, what kind of photography took those pictures?
So the questions about what type of photography was used to capture the images of the mass graves. Now, they would use drones so that they could hover directly above it. The old school fashion was to get a really tall ladder and get up above it. When you're doing an overall site photo, the old days, you might rent a helicopter. But a lot of this is, like some of the earlier excavations, the quality of the photos weren't that good. And as lenses, the technology the digital technology improved, they're getting much crisper. But there's a lot of photography, usually directly above, but then also you want these oblique photos from the side so that you get details that can't be seen. And the rule of thumb in archaeology is you can never take enough photos. You can take more than you think you need, and when you're writing the report and doing the analysis, you think, why didn't I take more photos? Did you question?
Are the shells found on the Lusitania still explodable?
Are the shells on the Lusitania still explodable? Yes. Maybe not as they are now, but if you remove them and the air begins to dry the powder out, the most volatile time is when the environment is changing for the powder and for the fusing of whether it's ammunition or artillery shells. That's when something is most volatile.
All right. Who funds your archaeology digs? How are they funded?
This is asking about how the projects are funded. It's a variety. Some of these were highway projects that encountered it. So it's the government. that's doing it, or the contractor that's being mandated, depending upon the individual nation. Some of them, like the excavation at Frommel, was funded nationally by the Australian government. And then other ones, like the one that found Alan Fournier, was privately raised. There's an entire sort of range of things that are done. It's not one size fits all. Yes?
Is it a bureaucratic nightmare to get permission for these massive digging operations, say such as the Frommels? I mean, did the Australian government have to go through a lot of channels to get the permission to actually do the excavation there?
In case anyone didn't hear the questions about the potential hoops and permitting process that has to be gone through to deal with human remains. And the question is, yes, whether it's in this country or in Europe, there's an entire series of steps that have to be done when there are human remains involved. In Europe, I think there's even more agencies that have to be dealt with than here in the United States. But for instance, projects that I worked on where there were burials, once we ascertained that it was a burial by sort of exposing, part of it, usually the skull, then we would fill it back in and we would have to notify the state, apply for a specific permit to do that. There would have to be an advertisement placed in a local newspaper so that if somebody knew the identity or who was responsible or had interest in this, they would have an opportunity to come forward and give input into it. Yes?
RPA stand for at the end of your credentials?
What does RPA stand for? It's Registered Professional Archaeologist.
Oh, okay.
Yes?
I might have missed this at the beginning, but did you actually go overseas and have you seen some of these sites or worked on them?
Unfortunately, I have not. I would probably trample everyone between me and the door if there was an opportunity to do it. One of the issues is that, these projects are funded by different sources, so there's not a single institution that hires people that go in and do this. There are the staffs of colleges and museums, and it's very difficult for Americans to go to Europe and work as archaeologists. Call it nationalism or what you have, but they want Frenchmen working on French soil, and I can appreciate that. So no, I've never participated in any of these, but I follow them closely and gobble up every bit of information I get. Yes, sir.
Why do the combatants bury their enemy dead? Is it for sanitation or evidentiary reasons?
It's usually for, if you're in the back and didn't hear, he was asking why enemies bury their dead. It's really sanitation and also, because a rotting body is going to become a disease vector that can spread things. Flies are on the dead bodies, and then they're getting on food, your trenches. You've got the awful stench. So usually it's for self-comfort and preservation through sanitation. There were often truces, not so much on the Western Front, but especially in the Gallipoli campaign, because the trenches were very close to one another. And there were frequent truces between the Turks and the Allied soldiers, and they would actually go out and speak to one another and help them take their dead, partway to the trenches. They would even trade cigarettes while they were doing it because you needed something to try to cover up that stench. Yes?
And looking at all the photos of the skeletons and that young man from Australia, I was just wondering, I wonder what the average age was of these young people. I mean, that one boy looked like he would have been in high school.
In case you didn't hear the questions about the average age of these soldiers and the youthful appearance of Harry Willis, the Australian who lost the medallion. I don't know what the average age is because it's going to change depending upon the nationality. I know that Harry Willis was a 19-year-old farmhand when he died. And I've often seen, I know one of his other mates that was identified was 40 years old. So it wasn't uncommon for older men to enlist. And in fact, Harry Willis was underage. He forged his mother's signature to enlist. His older brothers had enlisted, and he received a white feather in the mail. And the white feather was a way of shaming cowards. If you thought somebody wasn't supporting the war effort and was not enlisting, you would leave a white feather on their doorstep in their mailbox. And Harry Willis, even though he was underage, received a white feather. That and probably his brother's participation spurred him on. And when his mother found out, she didn't make any effort to stop him from going. So she acquiesced. So there's an entire range, and especially as the war goes on, the age of the combatants will increase through attrition. So it wasn't uncommon, in 1918 to have some pretty old Englishmen and Frenchmen and Germans because the younger guys had been chewed up already. All right. Thank you.
Here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books has cooks and cooks and hacks and cracks and yarns and sings and rocks and swings and more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. Make you feel like yoga. Hey, yogi, 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 yogi. Hey, yogi, yogi, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch. We'll provide the pot. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.